Hello everyone, I'm Grandmaster Denes Boros, and this is Insane in the Endgame. Not as insane as an Alireza Firuza game. It's actually a little bit more calmer than that. Less drama, more Richard Réti. So, the topic of today is a bit of Richard Réti. Richard Réti is actually a player sort of undeservedly untalked about, or not talked about rather, even though he was kind of the player inventing all these hyper-modern openings. And for that purpose, I am going to show you a couple of things in the opening. Now, of course, there's plenty of Réti systems. One of the Réti systems is B3. I actually worked out a repertoire for this as white, which is a very interesting move. D5, bishop B2, and here white sacrifices a pawn for good compensation. But that's really beside the point. It just again shows how influential Réti really is. The other point that's actually interesting and what shows why he is so important, he was the first player to actually identify that you don't have to have pieces on the board. I mean, you don't have to have directly occupying those center squares if you can control the squares. And this plan of b3 bishop b2 is original in this sense that he's not trying to actually get pawns there. He's just trying to put pressure on them. Similarly enough, is the knight f3, d5, g3 idea, which is the Réti. White is planning to put pressure on the e5 square and put pressure on the d5 pawn with side moves. Again, merely controlling those squares and not really trying to occupy it. So I see chat saying, yeah, but I think his best contributions were Masters of the Chessboard and all of his puzzles. Well, it's one thing that he was great with his puzzles. Those are actually quite amazing. And in fact, you can see from his games that he has a tactical vision like not many. And sadly, because he didn't have like a full career in his time and in his prime, he couldn't quite show how talented he is. Just like Breyer, he really didn't get a shot to show more that they were capable of. Like, I think one of those players really underappreciated is Richard Réti. Thankfully, recently the Réti opening has been really good and really popular, so his name still is ringing bell for others. So I see the message by Exquisite. I played through 50 or so of his games a few years ago. He's a real genius. It's a shame how little known he is. I'm glad Boros is such a fan. Yes, I've known a couple of his games, and if you haven't checked out his King's Gambit part and his King's Gambit games, it's something you should, because if you check those out, you'll understand why Magnus Carlsen plays some certain sublines of the King's Gambit himself. Well, because it was sort of influenced by Richard Réti, and Réti was unique the way he kind of approached his game. Like, his whole hyper-modern chess is different from the times he was at and in. But okay, this game that we're going to take a look at is between Rudolf Spielmann and Richard Réti, and we're going to take a look at how Richard Réti handles the endgame. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6. And we all have that impression that the Berlin wasn't really played until like the 2000s when Kasparov and Kramnik played their match. but actually was pretty popular even earlier than that. This is played in the early 1900s, which might surprise some of you. Castles, knight e4, d4. But instead of the now topical knight d6 and this ending, which leads to the Berlin endgame, originally everybody played bishop e7, which is actually a move more or less playable. There's nothing wrong with this one, but of course, knight d6 after that World Championship match in London superseded this idea. Yeah, Mani is correct. Rudolf Spielmann was a very strong tactical player, and this again, this opening choice shows that Richard Réti is a shrewd psychologist as well. Knight takes e5. Knight takes e5, castles. Not the most aggressive way of playing. I'm not gonna delve too deep in how to play this opening, but it is definitely queen e2 that has to be tried in this type of position, immediately pressing down the center. Knight takes e5 is a little bit inaccurate and sort of leads into exchanges. Queen e2, d5. Now, e takes d6 would be played or could be played if this was more of more of like a round robin event where white is is happy with a draw. But in this game, as we all know, Rudolf Spielmann is an aggressive player, so he's not that interested in exchanges. Instead goes for c4, c6, c takes d5. And again, look at that. This is a game from 1910, yet we see splendid combinations. C takes b5 would run into queen takes e4, which is nothing good. But of course, Réti takes with the queen. Bishop d3, bishop f5, queen f3, rook d8, bishop takes e4. Now, we get something very similar to a Berlin endgame, but also somewhat resembling Slav / Queen's Gambit accepted positions. So queen takes c4, bishop takes c4 wouldn't be that great because of queen g3, and there's pressure on this king. There's this idea of bishop h6 and knight c3, and in all cases not such a simple position. But Réti doesn't really shy away from endgames, and he always sees the beauty of it all. He believes that there are tactical nuances and interesting twists in endings, which is actually unique. Whenever you check out, and I do encourage everyone who's looking and watching this to check out his puzzles, because they're deep down in the endgame, as Réti kind of decided that, hey, yes, it's an endgame, but even endgames have like deep set combinations hidden there. King takes c4, bishop takes c4, knight c3. And if you might be asking why, well, what is so special about those? Well, Réti designed his puzzles without any computer help, obviously, and had to kind of delve deep into positions to make sure that there are no multiple solutions. Also, he was very well known and is well known to set up traps for the reader so you can go astray and have a journey of your own finding the solution. Bishop f5. Obviously, once black gets the bishop pair, it makes a lot of sense to keep them on the board. You do not want to exchange, and that's kind of the main hope. The longer the game goes, the more powerful those bishops get. Bishop e3. And here's the moment where we should try to figure out how to defend against Spielmann's simple threat. It's not that black is already having a decisive advantage, in fact, far from it. I mean, there's this idea of b6, but also a6. Both b6 and a6 make a lot of sense. Pawn b2? How would you like to reach the pawn on b2? But even c5 makes some level of sense, but yeah, I mean, the big question is, what's the difference between playing c5 here or b6? And there are those little twists and details that make or break a good game or defines a very strong chess player. Now, if black would have played c5, the issue is there's knight b5 hitting there. Actually, even then there's bishop d3, and that's not an idea. But the main problem with c5 is it gives knight d5 a chance, and if the knight can hop into d5, black cannot really hope for an advantage, and white cannot be worse. And if bishop e6, then knight b5 would come, a6, knight d6, and this opposite colored endgame is favorable for white because of this strong d6 pawn, which will be supported by the bishop. So in any case, what Réti has to keep in mind is not to start exchanging off that dark squared bishop, in fact to keep it. So he understands that the d5 and b5 squares are all important, so he shies away from c5. He also doesn't play a6 because that would also weaken the dark squares on c5 and b6. Therefore, he played b6 in this position, closing off this bishop and still kind of controlling the all important squares on d5 and b5. Rook d1. And here comes the big question, whether we should shy away from exchanges or not. The reason you have to ask this from ourselves is because with every exchange, you get much closer to a draw. So we've got to reason, and dear viewer, try to figure out, would you exchange on d1 or not? Is there any benefits of avoiding it or exchanging? Definitely black has these 3 pawns, 3 versus 2 on the queen side, but white has a majority on the king side, so it's not at all a clear-cut decision. It doesn't make it easy. I think the position is still very much complex. Exquisite is saying exchanging on d1 gives away the file, so I don't like that on principle. I will play h6 and see what white does, but perhaps bishop d7. So one of the key things when you're trying to realize an advantage is not to become too passive. If you go bishop d7, yes, you avoid exchanging the rooks, but you're actually kind of putting your pieces back. Not to mention of the fact that white knight can slalom to e4, knight e4 and knight d6, and as we talked about that before, there is knight d6. If we have to take with this bishop on d6, we can't really even dream of winning this game, which what Réti is clearly dreaming of. So going back with the bishop does accomplish not exchanging, but would be a little bit too passive to work. I see bishop b4 does put some pressure on the position, but I'm not sure if I see your idea behind it. Because as I mentioned, we don't want to have an opposite colored bishop ending. Well, you do create an island, but islands are cool, and islands are even cooler when they're opposite colors. It's not at all win for black. In fact, it's very close to a draw in this case. So we did mention bishop moves, either trying to press on the c3 knight or just try to avoid exchanges. But the question is, in the long run, what is black should be aiming for? What will be the meta for this game? Rook d3 is a very interesting idea. Rook d3. Trying to keep the rook there and then also prepare the rook. Rook d3 is, by the way, a very typical Grandmaster move these days. You are offering the exchange of rooks on the prerequisite that you actually help and put my bishop to a better square, which is very important, and that's one of the ways to get a position better inch by inch. Now, Réti decides to take it anyways. Rook takes d1, rook takes d1, rook d8. So actually Réti decides to go for the exchange, but that means that he has kind of an inherent faith in this position. Why does Réti have a hope for an advantage? Chat viewers, what do you think? What could be the reason he believes, even though the rooks are off, he can still win this game? Well, black has the bishop pair, right? Black has a bishop pair. And that's one thing, but the bishop pair by in itself isn't necessarily enough. Bishops and hanging pawns? Not quite sure what you mean there, Giovanni. So takes. Black clearly has some advantage because of the bishops, but that wouldn't be enough. It actually has to do with the 3-2 on the other side of the board. And thankfully for Réti, and this is, by the way, very much a Berlin type of position, this e-pawn is sort of over-advanced. If it would be on e4, probably Spielmann wouldn't have trouble holding this position. But as the pawn is already on e5, it's more of a target, and it's much harder for Rudolf to actually maneuver around. King f1. King f1 is a great move. So here we've got to improve our pieces. How should we do that? Current candidates, king f8, bishop e6. What else? What else would be an idea? Well, checking doesn't really help. It actually would help someone, but not black, because the king would walk into the center. Well, a5 is an interesting idea, but your a pawn has a duty right now. It has a duty of defending the b pawn. If you start pushing it, these pawns become progressively more and more weak. One of the idea could be bishop c7, going after that one. So f6 is a natural move and a good move at that, Yanai, but the thing is, if you go f6, you would sort of start exchanging, which naturally trends towards a draw, not a win. So if you're trying to win, it's a better strategy to keep as much piece on the board as possible. So in this sense, I like this suggestion of bishop c7. It wasn't played by Richard Réti, but it actually makes sense, sort of provoking f4. Not only do you provoke f4, but eventually now you could build a fortress in Berlin style, just going h5 and holding and halting the plan of white. He actually went king f8, and I do think bishop c7 is just as good, but probably Réti felt that there's nothing wrong with bringing the king in now. Also notice, bringing in the king now is much better than pushing the a pawn. Not that the a pawn push is bad, but after the king comes closer, it gains in strength. So king f8 here. Now he goes bishop c7, tries to attack this pawn. f4, king e8, king f3, and here comes the aforementioned h5, controlling the g4 square. Now this play, what we see now from Réti, maybe wouldn't open any eyes, because we've seen these Berlin ideas recently, but again, just a reminder, this is sort of the late 1910, 14th times, so it's still early in history, so still before World War II, mind you, and Réti already knows what he's supposed to be doing. Knight e4. Okay, so knight e4 is actually a great move by Rudolf Spielmann, and here we've got to figure out what is Rudolf Spielmann really after with this move. So first off, we have to identify our opponent's plans to actually react to them. So it's not that bishop c7, the idea of attacking the e5 pawn, was decisive, but is a step in the right direction. So what is white trying to do? What would be white's next move? So one of the big moves is indeed knight d6. So if you just dilly-dally, play something like a5, knight d6, takes, and there is zero hope of you winning this because of the opposite colored bishop ending. Therefore, we need to make an idea and find a move that avoids this. So it's white, not white to move. It is actually, we figured out what white is trying to do. White is trying to get some knight d6 in there. Yes, sometimes knight g5 can be annoying, but that's not the main threat. The main threat is the immediate simplification, so we've got to avoid that one. King d7 sounds good enough. However, Réti decided to go bishop e6. And there is like one distinct difference between bishop e6 and king d7, and that is that this one immediately threatens to take the a pawn Fischer style, even though this has been played roughly 50 years before Fischer, which is scary if you think about that. So bishop e6, bishop takes a2 is on the map clearly because the bishop could waltz out after the capture, so it's not something that white can underestimate. a3. And again, it seems like there's nothing special going on, but Réti spots an idea and a very, very, very nasty move. So let's try to find Réti's next move. It's not really decisive, but puts a lot of pressure on white's position. Bishop d5. For one, it stops this idea of knight d6. Second of all, it puts a pin on this king on f3. By the way, you might have asked, what about knight d6? So with knight d6, actually black would have a choice. Black could even consider taking now. I said before that these are drawn, but if white manages to get the d6 pawn or start pushing 3-1 advantage on the other side, there are some hopes for winning. But even if this doesn't appeal to Réti, he could go king d7 and set up this double attack. But anyways, Rudolf Spielmann played a3, bishop d5. So bishop d5 is nice and puts a lot of pressure on that king and knight. But again, still it begs the question, what would be black's plan right now? So let's look for some plans, because it's key even in the endgame to have an idea of what you're looking for. So look for plans, look for ways of further improving this position for black. F5 is an interesting idea, trying to force the issue. But as we said earlier on, we don't necessarily want to force trades, even if it's beneficial for us, because the more exchanges happen, the more likely we are going to have to acquiesce for a draw. G6 is a bit more of a defensive move in nature, JMac. Not a bad move, but it's not a plan that would further our goal. So let's try some long-term plans. And for long-term plans, we have to identify which piece of ours is sort of left out of the play. So the bishop on d5, of course, is doing a great job pressing that king and pressing the knight. But what other pieces we have that don't really contribute to the final goal of winning? So we can argue definitely that it's the bishop. Is there anything else that we could improve upon? And it's again sort of measuring up which is more important. And just a hint, there is another piece that is not ideal. And it's the king. It's mostly the king that needs to have an idea where it goes to. Now, I see king e7 suggested, but there is another move that sort of has the same purpose, but in fact has another layer of ideas behind that one. So there's a difference between going king e7 or going king d7. What could be that subtle difference between going e7 or d7? Imani is saying it is nearer to the queen side. Okay, but first off, what does king e7 kind of achieve? So what is the basic idea we have? Don't forget, never forget your original threats. And if you remember your threats, you will never forget of what you're looking to get in the future. Well, the king is actually trying to walk up to f5. If we could get the king up to f5, we would be winning this knight because of that pin. King e7 wouldn't be easy to meet, because anytime you would push the pawn, this bishop on c7 would snipe down the e pawn. But okay, let's see what Spielmann does. He goes bishop d4 for that exact reason. So if we would go king d7, there's potentially f5, and now white gets active enough, might even get some chances of his own. So therefore, here Réti plays c5, pushes the bishop back, bishop c3, g6. And this is what we talked earlier on. White builds, there is this white square blockade working in the position. And just like in many Berlin positions, it's very difficult to deal with. And even though white has like a clear majority on the king side, the bishop's sort of holding them up. King e3, and now he goes king d7. And I really like king d7 in this position because it kind of winks in both directions. Just like in football or soccer, as it's well known in America, it's better to be ambiguous with your plans, and if you're looking on both directions, they'll never know which way you're going. That's why king d7 is so much better than king e7, because in that case it's blindingly obvious that Réti would go king e6, king f5. Here it can go the other direction on the queen side, and with the majority of 3 versus 2, there is a good hope of winning that. So g3, and now again, talking about improvement. We already improved our king, but there is one more piece that we haven't improved. Which one is that? Which one is that? So, well, yeah, they can give that check, but we can go king c6 and we get a very active king for that. So yeah, you can go here. When I go king c6, takes, and with that extra pawn majority on this side of the board, even if you go a4, I can go a6 and b5. So by all means, this is very comfortable for black. A better king than this one. Might even threaten to just run it down through c4 and b3, and there is some ample chances of winning this. And even if it's not winning, it is clear that it's black who is pressing for the win. So g3 was played, but here it was very important to decide and realize that the other guy that's not doing too much is this bishop on c7. So Réti just reroutes it. Goes bishop d8, knight d6, bishop e7, king d3. And now they're going to have this standoff. Actually, black is not going to take that because opposite colored endings are usually drawn. So, but Réti believes that he has more than that. So he goes a6, king e3. Now this is the critical moment for us to decide which direction are we going to go for. Of course, taking on d6 still is very drawish, so not gonna help us too much. So we've got to decide which way should we go if we want to win this game. So JMac is saying queenside, okay. Why would you go queenside? Exquisite is asking, I looked at bishop d8, but is it really nicer to have the bishop on e7 than c7? Well, maybe it's not pretty, but in chess, a bishop doesn't really have to be too attractive, as long as it's useful. And if anything, this bishop is very useful, as it sort of puts pressure on both directions, both on the king side, both on the queen side. And if your piece is multi-purpose, then you really can't ask more from that piece. And if you think that bishop was better on c7, not really, because it was sort of just firing at pawns that were already kind of protected. So I do believe that the maneuver by Réti is superior than just leaving the bishop on c7. So, and in these type of positions, you've got to realize what is the benefits and what the bishop pair wants likes. So what type of positions, chat and dear viewers, does the bishops like the most? So Exquisite says king c6 is my move here. We did Capablanca, and Capablanca plays 3 versus 2. Definitely an option. Definitely an option. So bishops want open positions, open diagonals. At the moment, our bishop on e7, someone mentioned that it's not that pretty, and okay, I can agree. It's not the most attractive bishop you can find. In fact, the most attractive one is on d5, chilling and sort of lording down the board, which is cool. But we really don't exert too much pressure on the all-important c4, b4, and a4 squares, and if we want to open up the position, we have to have some influence on that direction. So if we can't open it up on the queen side, what other options do we have? Well, you can try g5, but is that the only option we have? The only problem we have with h4 is, if we go h4, they don't have to react to us. They can, let's say, pass, and even if we take, exchanges doesn't really further our agenda. So exchanges are not good enough. Yana is asking, would king e6 and then f6 be an idea? So if you go king e6 and f6, would that open up the position just a little bit? So Vinayak is asking, is f6 the best? Yes or no? So the beautiful part of chess is that there are multiple answers. It can be great, and it can also have some downsides too. So there's pluses and minuses in playing f6 right here or avoiding it. But it's never like a clear-cut answer whether that's great or not, especially in strategic positions. Of course, if it would be like a tactics melee, yes, you could tell if f6 is terrible or if it's great. But in endgames, oftentimes, it's again a bit ambiguous. So here actually, Réti played king e6. In fact, keeping it even more ambiguous. King e6. And the benefit of these moves are that it doesn't show their hand. In some very prominent card games, you do not want to show your intentions nor the direction of your play. King e6 is sort of played in the same way. He's activating his king, but he's not telling you if he's going to play g5 or f6. He's saying, it's your turn. You can decide to react whichever way you want, but I'm not going to show you my cards just yet. King d3. And we would be tempted to play f6 here, but here comes Richard Réti's genius. He says, no, I am going to make sure that all of my pawns are defended. So what did Richard Réti play here in this very position? Waiting for a white mistake? Not necessarily, but Réti is still very much open not to tell what he's hoping to do. So bishop d8. And this is the move that doesn't look and doesn't strike too inspiring. However, it is a prophylactic move by nature. He makes sure this pawn is defended. Let's say if Black would play f6, then there is this move of knight c8, hitting this pawn, hitting this bishop, and then there is this move of e takes f6, sort of diminishing and annulling all the efforts that Réti could have. Not necessarily losing for Black, but he cannot hope for an advantage. So here bishop d8 is a very strong move, because it sort of circumvents this idea of knight c8, and prepares this f6 move instead. And I can tell you personally, whenever I stream, I try to look for ideas such as this, and I can tell you, I was inspired by Réti and his prophylaxis. He does everything in his hands to make sure that there is no funny business going on, and Spielmann doesn't have a way to trick him. So bishop d8 makes sense, and yeah, it's very inspiring, so no wonder I try to look for this myself whenever I play online. So bishop d8, bishop d2, and when Rudolf Spielmann is sort of hesitating and showing the hands, then he goes f6. And now as the bishop moved away, then there's this move f6. Again, as I mentioned before, this reminds me more of a card game than a chess game. Réti kept it as unclear as possible by not really showing the intentions or his true intentions, and now he sort of made Spielmann make an unforced error by this move of bishop d2, and already he's getting close there. Bishop c3, f takes e5, and you can already see that he made some progress. F takes e5 is one other alternative. He goes bishop takes e5. Iman is asking, aren't you supposed to play on your majority side? Well, yes, but as I talked about, you are trying to play for your advantages, and you're playing for the advantage of your bishop pair plus the 3+2. And now he goes b5. And again, this is kind of, this slow maneuvering kind of reminds me of the greatest endgame players out there. He is in no rush to tell his intentions, and he just slowly strengthens his positions first. And what is kind of unique here is that first he kind of resolved the issue of the bishop pair. It was more of a close position, still is a little bit close. This bishop doesn't feel too happy. But if it could go behind those pawns, black would be practically winning. That's why it's so important that he could pull back his bishops. A little bit like Gatakomsky. Gatakomsky was very good in endgames at a very young age. And he was a master of pulling his bishops away. Like pulling this bishop away so it's kept for the later part of the game. So we've been like playing a couple of moves, like 10, 12 moves, and there were many dangerous moments where it was in danger of being exchanged, but Réti made sure that it is withdrawn and it cannot be exchanged, so he kept the bishops, and now the position is opening up. Knight e8, bishop b7, king c3, bishop b6. Look at that, he's reorganizing his pieces. And as I mentioned, he might be threatening ideas of c4, bishop g1. Knight g7, king d5. Note that the basic rules of endgames still matter. If he can, he will activate his king, bring it to the center, and then activate those bishops. Knight e8, c4. Owning the most important square, the bishop d4 move is not possible, and bishop g1 is on the agenda. h3, bishop f2, g4. And this is another critical moment. Should we take on g4, or should we avoid that exchange? And a good point by Exquisite. Yes, the king is sort of cut off, but if you go this direction, meaning the king side, the queen side will be weak. If it stays on the queen side, then there are problems on the king side. We should avoid the exchange. So whenever you're playing in an endgame, you always need to find a target. It's not enough to have a bishop pair. Sometimes it's not even enough to have a majority on one side. But if you would have two targets in a position, that usually is enough to win the game. What would be a perfect target for Réti to generate in this position? Exquisite is saying h4. There's an interesting idea, avoiding the exchange, but does it really create a target for the future? Well, it actually does, and that is exactly what Réti plays. He goes h4, and now there is a potential target on h3 with a potential passer on the H file, which can be super useful at the end of the day. Knight f6, king e6, and we have our target, while this king does have to treat and be careful with the 3 versus 2. And notice how he slowly outplays his opponent. Knight h7, bishop g2, tightening the grip. Knight g5, king d5, bishop c3, bishop g3. It's getting closer and closer, and once he smokes out that knight, this endgame is very close to be just winning. f5, takes, bishop f4, and now it is collapsing, because if you go bishop d2, there's takes, king e5, and the pawn falls, while the h-pawn is falling as well. So here Spielmann goes for the desperado, bishop takes here, bishop h6, bishop d2, here, bishop c3, king e6. And now we get into the endgame phase, as actually Réti has accomplished to get a very strong grip on the position. He's winning 2 important pawns, and he's gonna have passed pawns on both sides, which is key whenever you're playing opposite colored bishop endings. And actually the biggest tragedy for Spielmann is that bishop f2 would win the pawn, but this king is just unfortunately placed. If you go here, black can just check you and go h3, retaining the 2-pawn advantage. Bishop c8, king b4, king e6, again ambiguous. The king can walk to f5, that also can go king d5, and again that kind of puts pressure on the opponent, and they'll have to decide what happens next. King c5, h3, very close to promoting. King f5, a4, king g4, and if the king gets to g2, it's just game over. AB, king takes, king f3, and again this shows this is the precision of the player named Richard Réti. He's not afraid of nothing. He knows he can go and defend the c pawn from behind. There's no way you'll lose that pawn, and if you win that bishop, that is of course a clear-cut win for black. Bishop h2, bishop b8, bishop e6, obviously defending. You cannot give up both pawns. In that case, it's a draw. But after bishop e6, it is game over, because you have to give up that bishop in order to stop promotion. King c3, king c2, king f2, and Rudolf Spielmann resigned. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this lecture on how to kind of milk an advantage that is seemingly so little, yet Réti makes it look so much and so easy. First off, preserving the bishop there, then opening up the position, pushing a little bit on the queen side, and then with a sudden switch going over to the king side, and just in time to wrap it up and win the game on a single tempo. So it was hinging on one tempo, even though Réti was absolutely brilliant in this endgame. So I really hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I'd hope to see you guys in the future on other streams, this stream, and other lectures next week. And